And welcome back to the European Parliament in Brussels for the second part of Talking Europe on France 24, where I'm joined by the chair of the ECR, the European Conservatives and Reformists group. It's the third largest group in the European Parliament. And it's a group of the British Conservatives. Syed Kamal, welcome to the show. Now, you chair the ECR, as I said. You're a close ally of David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, who won a resounding victory last week, against all the odds, I should say. He has an outright majority, which means that he was able to form a government without his previous coalition partners, the Lib Dems, who were by and large regarded as pro-European. Some say we have now the most Eurosceptic government since Margaret Thatcher. Is that right?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me on here today. It was a great victory. It was quite clear that we stuck to our plan, which was to emphasise all the progress that we had made since 2010, created 2 million new jobs, over 2 million apprenticeships, clearly an agenda for growth. And I think that contrasted sharply with the opposition parties. And in the end, I was very pleased that the British public put their faith in us. In terms of Euroscepticism or not, actually what David Cameron was quite clear about was that the time to discuss our relationship with Europe has come. And it's about time that the British people had a say on our relationship with the EU. No one under the age of 58 has had a say on that relationship since we joined the EEC in the early 70s. But what he said as well was that rather than look at the deal now, he'll try and negotiate a better relationship, not just for Britain, but actually for the whole of the EU, to meet the challenges that we face.
When will the referendum take place?
At the moment, we are looking at 2017, by the end of 2017. That's what David Cameron always said, and he made it quite clear that what he wanted to do, first of all, was focus on winning the general election, and then after that, starting the real negotiations. So at the moment, we have 2 years, at least 2 years, to look forward to a negotiation.
Well, 2 years might not be that long to convince your European partners. And there is a problem there. I think a lot of Europeans don't really understand what Mr. Cameron wants to achieve, because Britain, after all, is not in the Eurozone, it's not in Schengen. You have a series of opt-outs and a rebate. What does Mr. Cameron want on top of that?
Well, it's really important that we make it quite clear that there's a great scepticism in Britain about our current relationship. And that will be tested. But there's also a massive gap in perceptions. Let me give you an example. I was elected in 2005, around the time that the French and the Dutch had voted no in the referendum on the European Constitution. And I remember the debate in the European Parliament. It was supposed to be a reflection debate. It was supposed to be listening to the people of France and the people of Netherlands. But what it ended up being was a debate where people lined up to say, well, when the French voted no, or when the Dutch voted no, it wasn't about Europe, it was about something different. We must press on. And in one case, there was a group leader who stood up and said, nothing must be allowed to get in the way of the European project. Nothing must be allowed to get in the way of European political integration. Nothing must be allowed to get in the way of European economic integration. And I turned to my colleagues and I said, but that's not what the British people want. That's not what the British people see it. And they said, are you crazy? This is about building a United States of Europe or a Federal Republic of Europe. And when I'm back in London, in my own constituency, people there, they like the EU as part of trade, maybe a bit more international cooperation, but they certainly don't see it as building one country.
And concretely, what sort of powers does Mr. Cameron want to repatriate to London?
Well, I think there are a number of areas that we have to look at. The first one is clearly this idea of ever closer union, a United States of Europe, a Federal Republic of Europe, or further political integration. Let's get some clarity on what that means, because here I'm surrounded by people who say, this is the aim, this is what we're aiming for. You know, we have to be one country. Whatever the problem, the solution is always more Europe, more regulation, more spending. Let's have some clarity on that. The second issue, I think, is quite clear, that we are not members of the Eurozone. It is quite clear that Britain probably will not be a member of the Eurozone, if ever. And therefore, we're going to have to make sure in important decisions there is no caucusing, that, Britain and the non-Eurozone countries are outvoted. But also, let's be quite clear that what's really important about this is that we don't confuse the single currency with a single market, with banking union, with fiscal union, and we keep those issues quite separate. And the third issue is clearly around some of the issues about freedom of movement. Now, I'm from London. London has been an open, welcome city for centuries. We've taken in people from all over the world. But on the whole, it's been about people who come to Britain to work and to contribute. And I have colleagues here in Brussels who say to me, you should let anyone in from the EU, and from day one, they should be allowed to claim benefits. That is not what the British people want, and we have to deal with those issues.
But you can deal with those issues without a referendum. You mentioned 2005, the referenda in France and the Netherlands. You know how risky it is to hold a referendum. Of course, it's a democratic choice, but isn't Mr. Cameron playing with fire? There is a risk that British voters will turn against him and won't even read the question.
Not at all. I have great faith in the British people. We had a referendum, for example, on constitutional reform in Britain, on the so-called AV, alternative vote system, and the British people voted in that referendum and rejected the AV on the basis of that issue. We had referenda in Scotland on independence, and the Scottish people decided that they wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom. You know, I can't stand here or sit here as a politician and say the people are not smart enough to understand the issues in a referendum, yet they're smart enough to elect me. I trust that collective will of the British people.
And can David Cameron win this referendum?
Oh, clearly, it depends on what he gets in the negotiations. It depends on what's agreed with the other countries. And don't forget, this is not just a negotiation about Britain coming to Brussels with a shopping list. This is about reform for the EU as a whole. He's been quite clear about this. And some of my colleagues here who want to see that reform agenda, not only people in my own group, but some of the more reform-minded liberals and some of the more reform-minded Christian Democrats here, will say to me, we like what Cameron's asking for, because actually quite often we hide behind you in Britain and the reform agenda. So make sure you get a deal that's good for Europe. So, for example, we spend a lot of time here looking at institutional issues, almost back to that 1950s model of the European communities post-war, trying to meet those problems, actually, rather than stopping the navel-gazing, lifting our eyes and looking at the challenges outside the EU, America, China, emerging economies in the Far East and Africa. And that's what we should be looking at.
Now, you say that you have some allies within the Liberal group, for instance. Now, off the record, in France, many officials are fuming because they say you can't be part of a family, want all the rights but no duties, all the benefits but no responsibilities. And that's the perception of the game, so to say, that Britain is playing in Brussels.
I think there is quite clearly a difference of view between people who thinks that the EU is a one-size-fits-all EU and that you have to subscribe to everything, and others who say, well, hold on a minute, that's not what the EU should be about. Maybe we should be looking at ideas such as those countries that want to go further should be allowed to do so, and those countries who do not want to, go for ever closer union should be allowed to hold back. And we should be looking at some ideas around flexible geometry. We have some precedents for that, as you said quite rightly. We're not members of Schengen, we're not members of the single currency, but the assumption is there that you always will be. Actually, if we are better off not being part of that, it's a more flexible arrangement for everyone.
What will you do if there is a referendum? Do you want to stay in the European Union, personally?
I will wait to see what David Cameron negotiates. I have been looking at some of the ideas that I would like to see, issues around freedom of movement, issues around the Eurozone versus non-Eurozone, issues around trade, issues around some of the social and employment legislation. And I'm not going to say that these have to be red lines and if you don't get absolutely everything, because we all know when you go into negotiations, you go with a package. The other side say to you, that's very difficult. I'm really sorry, we can't deliver any of that. And then we get down to the nitty-gritty of the negotiations and you get some, hopefully most of it. And then I will decide on the package that David Cameron has achieved at the end of the day.
You know how passionate Europe can be in Britain. Britain is an island, proud of its traditions, and we all respect that. But when you read the British tabloids, the amount of stories on Europe, there are, most of the time, I have to say, caricatures. Can you have in Britain a rational debate about Europe?
I think one of the biggest myths I hear about the press in Britain is that how either right-wing or Eurosceptic we are. Let us look at the press in Britain. We have the BBC, rabidly pro-European. We have the Financial Times, rabidly pro-European. We have The Economist magazine, rabidly pro-European. We have newspapers like the Daily Mirror, the Guardian, the Independent, rabidly pro-European. Yes, we do have Eurosceptic newspapers, various shades of Euroscepticism, but actually what we have in the UK is a balanced press. We have all the shades of view on the EU, and that shows that what a healthy press we have in the UK.
Now, interesting to hear your reaction. Nigel Farage, the leader of the UK Independence Party, who lost his seat in South Thanet last week, vowed to resign and in the end didn't resign. Does it mean that Britain can't live without Mr Farage?
I think Britain has made it quite clear that it can live without Mr Farage. I'm not sure whether Mr Farage, having called himself the anti-politician politician, can live without politics. I thought it was an incredible resurrection of Nigel Farage, how he resigned and then magically unresigned. And actually it does him and it does his party no good. What worries me now is if we're going to have a proper debate on the merits of membership of the EU or not. Actually, if he decides to place himself at the forefront of the campaign saying to leave, that will become more unpopular. It's quite clear that as the UKIP popularity went up, the percentage of people who wanted to leave the EU actually went down because he toxifies that issue of scepticism.
Now let's talk about the issue of migrants in Europe. More Syrian migrants have arrived on the Greek island of Kos, that's in the Mediterranean. Due to its close proximity to the Turkish coast, it's seen an upsurge in the number of migrants attempting to get there from the Middle East. Elliot Richardson has more.
Sunny, tranquil, and with an array of golden beaches, the small Greek island of Kos is a tourist hotspot. But its location, just 4 kilometres from the Turkish coastal resort of Bodrum, makes it an ideal gateway to Europe for Middle Eastern migrants. 45 migrants, mostly from Syria, arrived on Kos's shores Monday morning in a tiny rubber dinghy. Exhausted and emotional, parents carried their children to the shore to seek a new beginning. Excitement etched on their faces after a treacherous 1-hour, 15-minute crossing.
The boat was full of water.
Was full?
And we were about to sink in.
This family had travelled all the way from Iraq.
11, my daughter, the eldest, and Ali 8, Zaid 5. Well, hoping to find life for my children.
The migrants were escorted to a nearby hotel for medical attention and water. 6,300 have arrived in Kos since the start of the year. Residents are concerned that the island's tourism industry might be affected.
No good business. The two big boat there before 2 days. No here.
The migrants hope to get a 6-month visa to stay in Greece. Meanwhile, the tourists continue to enjoy the delights of sunny Kos.
Syed Kamal, as you know, the European Commission is currently working on a plan to deal with the upsurge of migrants. It wants quotas. It wants basically European states to better share the burden, so to say, of migrants. It looks like a good idea because some countries are doing a lot. I'm thinking of Sweden and Germany, others very little. Portugal, Eastern Europe. And David Cameron doesn't like the idea. He wants to use an opt-out so that Britain does not participate in the scheme. Why is that?
Well, look, anyone who sees these pictures, the tragedy in the Middle East, but also the pictures of the migrants being picked up and those, sadly, who never made it across, you can't fail to be touched by that. You know, anyone who looks at those pictures and thinks you can dismiss them would be heartless. And in my heart, I would like to be able to welcome everyone who comes into the UK, but actually into the EU. But my head tells me I know that we cannot do that. Clearly, you know, we also have domestic political considerations. A country like mine, where we have a number of people via legal migration, but also via freedom of movement in the EU, we're already suffering some pressures on public services, which leads into political pressure because people are concerned about migration. It was a topic during the election. On top of that, for the EU now to say, I'm sorry, but you've got to take in more people, creates all sorts of pressures, either pressure on public services, but political pressure. Also, if you think about it, there are 6 countries in the EU, including Britain, including Germany, that take 75% of all asylum applications. It is time for other countries to take their share of the burden. When you consider a country like the UK, that one already takes in a number of asylum seekers, but also takes in a number of people through legal migration channels, you can already see the pressure. It's time for other countries.
But why don't quotas work? Because if you want to encourage countries like the Baltic states, for instance, to step up to the plate, the idea of better sharing the situation looks like a good idea.
But those quotas have to take account of some of the existing pressures that countries are already under, both through legal migration and asylum at the moment. And it's quite clear as well, we have to look at the push and pull factors. Some of those push factors, like civil war, will take time to tackle, and those countries will be unstable for some time. But you also have to look at the pull factor. If you make it too easy, it will encourage more people to come. What we have to be doing is processing people as quickly as possible to determine who are genuine asylum seekers and should be given refuge, and those who are, quite understandably, seeking a better economic life. Return those who are not legitimate refugees, and then process those who are legitimate. Let's get this right in the first place. The other thing we have to look at is on the other side, before they travel, can we stop them from travelling? Otherwise, they fall prey to human traffickers and criminals and falling into their arms. How do we make sure that we can process them as quickly as possible so they don't fall victim to these terrible people?
Saeed Kamal, I remind our viewers that you're the chair of the ECR, the European Conservatives and Reformists group in the European Parliament, the third largest group in the Parliament. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching this edition of Talking Europe. I was at the European Parliament in Brussels. It's time to go back to Paris now for more news on France 24.